Good morning and welcome to MEI's webinar on the future of Gaza and Hamas, integration or continued isolation. My name is Khaled Al-Gindi. I'm the director of the program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs here at the Middle East Institute. And we are delighted to have you join us for today's very, very timely discussion on Gaza. As the room fills up, I'll go ahead and give some introductory remarks and then introduce our speakers. So as we all know, the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has been in place since May 21st, but could fall apart at any moment, as we saw a couple of weeks ago with the launching of incendiary balloons from Gaza and followed by Israeli airstrikes. The 12-day war that we saw in May was the fourth or fifth, depending on how you keep count, in 12 years, and resulted in the killing of at least 248 Palestinians and 13 residents of Israel. Part of what makes this ceasefire so tenuous, of course, is that none of the underlying triggers or issues that led to the war have really been addressed, and in some cases have actually gotten worse. Most notably, the pending expulsions of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, and of course the ongoing blockade of the Gaza Strip. All of these remain unchanged. Despite the devastation that we saw in that 12-day war, Hamas's popularity among Palestinians has soared across the occupied territories, and even to an extent among Palestinians in Israel, in stark contrast to the situation with the Palestinian Authority, where Mahmoud Abbas's popularity has been really plummeting for quite some time, given his perceived impotence in the face of all of these crises. And today's discussion really is, I think, all the more relevant given the unrest and the ongoing protests against the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. To help us better understand the state of play with regard to Hamas in Gaza and internal Israeli politics and Israeli-Palestinian dynamics more generally, we've assembled a really stellar panel of experts. I'll introduce them here briefly, but you can see their full bios on the landing page for this event. First, we have Aaron David Miller, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a veteran State Department diplomat and peace negotiator, as well as the author of numerous books on the subject. Then we're pleased to have also Mouin Rabbani, who is co-editor of Jadaliya, an online magazine focused on Middle East affairs, and really one of the foremost experts on Palestinian politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last but certainly not least, we have Celine Touboul, who is the co-director of the Economic Cooperation Foundation, a leading Israeli think and do tank focused on creating the conditions for a genuine Israeli-Palestinian peace process and a viable two-state solution. She is also a senior advisor with Terrestrial Jerusalem. A few housekeeping issues before we jump right into the subject matter. The format for today's discussion is going to be a moderated Q&A. I will put some questions to each of our panelists to get the discussion going. The audience, are welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat, and keep the chat in case there are any you're having any technical problems. I will keep an eye on those questions and try to incorporate as many of them as we can into the second half of our discussion. Finally, please note that the webinar is being recorded. And again, if you have any technical problems, please put those in the chat box. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. So I'm going to start with Mouin. Give us a sense of how you saw this last conflict. What were the proximate causes for the latest round of violence, both in terms of Hamas-Israel dynamics, as well as intra-Palestinian and intra-Israeli dynamics. How is this war different from previous ones? And what prospects do you see for sustaining the ceasefire and turning it into a more long-term arrangement?
Thank you, Khalid. And let me start by thanking you and Middle East Institute for organizing this webinar and inviting me to participate. I do think the most recent events, those of May 2021, were in fundamental respects different than previous ones. And I think the best way to look at it is that in recent years, arguably with increasing intensity since Oslo, Palestinians have become increasingly fragmented and divided, primarily geographically, but also politically. And a situation developed where each individual Palestinian population center was exclusively concerned with its own immediate interests, what I would call kind of the municipal model of political activism. So Palestinians in Gaza were almost exclusively concerned with lifting the Israeli-Egyptian blockade on the Gaza Strip. Palestinians within Israel primarily concerned with confronting the growing racism of the Israeli state. Those in the West Bank primarily with growing settlement expansion and so on. What we saw here was that for the first time in a very long time, these different Palestinian communities came together at the same time, and came together for issues that were not primarily local. So when the events first began to develop in Sheikh Jarrah and the Haram al-Sharif in East Jerusalem, those who took the lead in confronting Israel's initiative to expel the families in Sheikh Jarrah, and then at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, were primarily Palestinians inside Israel. This time, Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other groups in the Gaza Strip, not only did they initiate matters with Israel, but for the first time since 2006, they did so for reasons that, at least on the surface, had absolutely nothing to do with conditions within the Gaza Strip, but rather were motivated by what was happening in Jerusalem. And subsequently, you had this mass mobilization in the West Bank in response to what was happening in the Gaza Strip and so on. So I think it's a moment, it's a potentially significant moment, and I think that will very much depend on what happens in the weeks and months to come. But Palestinians appear to be rediscovering a unity of purpose and a national agenda that has eluded them for a very long time. Now, finally, just to turn to the final part of your question about the potential longevity of this latest cessation of hostilities, I think it's a very difficult question to answer because, for example, after the last armed confrontation in 2014, nothing really changed. We were warned that if nothing changed, a new confrontation would quickly erupt. And lo and behold, it stayed in place for almost 7 years. This time, I think, there are additional factors, such as a growing realization by Hamas that it has a potential to enter and perhaps even lead the national movement, the growing disintegration of the legitimacy of Mahmoud Abbas and the PA and so on. But I wouldn't underestimate the capacity of the parties to muddle through. And it could all fall apart next week for any variety of reasons. So on that last point, I think it's very difficult to provide you with a clear answer.
Thanks, Moeen. Let's turn to the Israeli side of this equation with Celine. Celine, you recently wrote that the new Israeli government, the Bennett-Lapid government, has a very different approach to Gaza than what we saw during the Netanyahu era. Tell us how it's different, tell us what it is, and how it's different, and what this means for the sustainability of the ceasefire in Gaza and for the future of Gaza reconstruction. And I would just add to that, in terms of context, from what I'm hearing from my contacts on the ground in Gaza, the situation now is actually worse than it was before the blockade, in that there are more restrictions on things like agricultural products, and building materials seem to be banned entirely. What is the change, and is it actually a positive change?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on this very interesting panel. Well, so to respond to the first part of your question, there have been an important statement right after the ceasefire was concluded, primarily by our new Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, in regard to the need to strengthen the Palestinian Authority in the context of Gaza reconstruction and stabilization. And this statement, in my view, in itself, is a major departure from the previous government, which totally disregarded the Palestinian Authority as a relevant player, let alone the need to strengthen them. The policy of the previous government essentially consisted in maintaining the separation between Gaza and the West Bank, and was profoundly schizophrenic in regard to Hamas. Officially, it has sought to avoid the political legitimation of Hamas and prevent them from increasing their military capacity. But on the other hand, it has sought to preserve Hamas hold on Gaza out of fear, and then Hamas weakening will lead to a power vacuum and will undermine their ability and willingness to enforce a ceasefire. Strengthening the Palestinian Authority as a response to the potential risk of a power vacuum in Gaza, and as part of a strategy that would seek to enhance its role in Gaza, was never part of the equation for that government. And when Egypt tried in 2015-18 to lead a strategy that would pave the way for a gradual return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza and broker to that end a kind of power sharing arrangements between Fatah and Hamas, Israel basically vetoed any attempt to support the implementation of that strategy and directly contributed, in my view, to its failure. So in what sense could this shift contribute to the sustainability of a ceasefire and Gaza reconstruction? I think it's an important shift that should not be dismissed, as I don't think that Gaza stabilization can be achieved without the PA involvement. Primarily because, but not only because of that, none of the major infrastructure projects that are needed in Gaza are likely to materialize without the PA being involved. Now, I would agree that we are far from seeing the result of that shift. It has not translated into a reality yet, and the restrictions are major, as you have noted, Khaled. But I think that the challenge, therefore, will be to add some substance to this apparent shift in the Ministry of Defense position primarily. And for that, I think we will need a strong coalition to kind of challenge of our government to follow that with a different policy.
Thank you, Celine. Aaron, I'd like to turn to you and get your sense of how you see the latest war in Gaza in terms of what's different, what's not, and also give us your assessment of how you viewed the Biden administration's handling of the crisis, both in the lead up to the war, the actual war, and then post-crisis in terms of the current reconstruction efforts. What is the U.S. role in that part of it as well?
Thanks, Khaled, and thanks for including me, and it's a pleasure to be here with Muin and Celine. Look, I don't believe in transformations, and I'm a historian by training. The past has an extraordinary way of shaping the future, and not to trivialize this, because people died, mostly Palestinians, but there's a sort of eerie familiarity about this particular round and the previous three. It was an asymmetrical conflict. To quote the African proverb, when elephants fight, only the grass dies. And I think the suffering in Gaza, while not as profound as 2014, was horrific, both in terms of the numbers of children who were killed, but the destruction and damage. To borrow the Egyptian expression about previous wars, there was no victor and no vanquished, in my view. Both sides exaggerated their accomplishments, but you had a ceasefire in large part because both the Israelis and the Palestinians, at least Hamas in this case, believed that they had accomplished everything they wanted to accomplish and that they risked losing it if they continued. Now, whether that logic prevails and leads to a short or lengthy respite in the wake of conflict is unclear. Finally, I think it's obvious that none of the underlying causes of what fuels and powers conflict in Gaza have been resolved. This is very much a work in progress. As I mentioned, I don't believe in transformations. I think the likelihood of a fundamental change in Gaza is probably very unlikely. It would require a degree of coordination and political will and politics falling into place in a way that they rarely do. But this round was different, I think. It was different in the sense that it went beyond local conditions in Gaza in terms of Hamas's calculations. Although Sinwar's shaky status, the end of Qatari subsidies, all of these things created, I think, pressure on Hamas to do something. The link with Jerusalem was new and very effective. And quite surprisingly, the worst communal violence between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews since the state of Israel was created even suggested that Hamas may have exceeded even its wildest expectations in linking the future of Palestinian citizens of Israel with the broader Palestinian cause. It's remarkable to me, though, that within weeks, or at least within a month or so of the ceasefire, which was May 20, you had, for the first time in the political history of the state, a small Arab party headed by Mansour Abbas, the United Arab List, representative of the Southern Islamic Movement branch of the Islamic movement in Israel, actually agreeing for the first time to participate in a government which is largely dominated by three right-wing parties and a right-wing prime minister. It's still extraordinary development. As far as Biden is concerned, form follows function here. The prime directive of the Biden administration is domestic recovery and fixing America's broken house. That suggests a very limited bandwidth when it comes to foreign policy generally, and certainly when it comes to foreign policy issues that aren't particularly productive and won't pay dividends and have domestic political implications. I think that the president borrowed a page from his former boss's view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and did the opposite of what Obama might have done during in these circumstances. Not make the United States the center of the conflict, minimize its public role and public comments, support the Israelis, at least during the first week of the confrontation, and then bring a limited amount of pressure in order to secure a ceasefire. One final comment. I think the administration's political problem with the eruption of the Palestinian issue now, which they may not have anticipated, domestically, is to navigate a course between a Republican Party determined still to remain the go-to party when it comes to support for Israel on one hand, and a deeply divided Democratic Party whose progressive wing is increasingly pushing the administration to press the Israelis to do more, to give more with respect to the Palestinian issue. the conflict and certainly the formation of the new government to a degree minimizes the negative political implications for the administration of trying to navigate this course. Whether it will hold in the future depends on what happens on the ground.
Thanks for that, Aaron. If I could, I'd like to stay with you for a minute and sort of zoom out a little bit more and look at the role of other third parties in the current stabilization effort. Egypt, in particular, seems to be playing an especially a much more proactive role than it seems to have been playing in the past, both in terms of the reconciliation effort, that file that has always been under Cairo's jurisdiction, and the reconstruction effort. Why do you think that is? And is there an opportunity to bring in other regional actors? You know, we hear so much about the Abraham Accords as having the potential to impact the Israeli-Palestinian track. Is there a role for states like the UAE or perhaps the Saudis in whether it's internal Palestinian reconciliation or more likely the reconstruction effort in Gaza?
No, Khaled, because this is not a traditional mediation where the United States could actually play an effective role in brokering an agreement between two combatants. Third parties become critically important. And again, the past is prologue here. For all the vaunted praise to the Abraham Accords, and I don't want to undermine their significance, they do represent many things. What they don't represent, however, is an effective effort on the part of any of the four parties that have restored diplomatic relations with Israel, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, Sudanese, or the Moroccans, to play a role. It was Egypt. And it was Egypt because of proximity, of geographic and political realities that will always give the Egyptians much more to lose and much more to gain as a consequence of their involvement. Sisi is in the doghouse, to say the least, with respect to this administration. I noticed that there is legislation I saw this morning which would impose additional restrictions on the distribution of Egyptian U.S. military assistance to Egypt as a consequence of Egypt's human rights abuses and transgressions. Sisi, I think, rose to the occasion to demonstrate, and in fact, he was right, that if the Biden administration wanted to park the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a consequence of their domestic priorities, they better pay much more attention to Egypt's central role in stabilizing the situation and keeping things as quiet as they can be. It was not the Emiratis who played a role in this. If any of the Gulf states contributed, it was the Qataris. And Egyptian-Qatari relations, which are improving as a consequence of the reconciliation between, to some degree, to a large degree, between the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris, should, I think, to some degree, increase Qatar's role. Economically, they've pledged, in addition to the $360 million annually, they've pledged an additional $500 million, as have the Egyptians. Although I don't know, on the latter, that seems like a rather large commitment. One last point. I think the Emirati role is simply limited. It's limited because of the antagonism with Hamas. It's limited because of the perception and reality that the Emirates are supporting Mohammed Dahlan, which is anathema to Abbas and the PA. So I think it's going to be difficult for the Emiratis to play a direct role in Gaza. I think it's Egypt, it's Qatar, and of course, as a third party, as Celine suggested, the prospects of a new role for the Palestinian Authority.
Thanks, Aaron. Maureen, I'd love to get your thoughts on both the U.S. and Egyptian and other regional roles in the current dynamic. But I want to dig in a little bit deeper also on the reconstruction effort, which, you know, all indications seem to suggest that it's really stalled. There's an attempt to revive the old Gaza reconstruction mechanism that was created after the 2014 war, which eventually sort of fell by the wayside, largely because it was bypassed, and, you know, Qatari cash was able to come in directly with the approval of the Israeli government. But now, as we saw the situation, the restrictions are worse. Building materials are not going in. What does the reconstruction effort look like to you, or what is actually required to have an effective reconstruction process in Gaza that will help stabilize the situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always felt that these initiatives to try to achieve something while maintaining the occupation is ultimately futile. We've had the experience of economic development under occupation, of establishing state institutions under occupation, of establishing democracy under occupation, and all of it failed kind of as a foregone conclusion. And I would make a similar argument about reconstruction under blockade. It was attempted in 2000, after 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and so on. And, the reconstruction from the 2014 Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip had barely got out of the starting blocks, and now this. So I do think there's a need to focus on fundamental issues, on underlying issues, and not about symptoms that ultimately can't be treated because the underlying symptoms are ignored. So, you're basically talking about humanitarian band-aids being put on a very serious hemorrhage, and I really wouldn't expect significant reconstruction efforts unless and until not only, first and foremost, the underlying issue of the blockade is addressed and resolved. And in addition to that, the broader issues of occupation and related issues are addressed as well. Now, to get back to the first part of your question, I think it's important to recognize that what's been different in the past year in terms of how various regional parties have dealt with Israel and the Palestinians is that to a large extent, they've been primarily motivated by their relationship with the US. So I think, the Abraham Accords, while they, of course, so-called grandiosely entitled Abraham Accords, while they did have regional aspects, it was primarily transactions between the Arab states involved and Washington for concessions from Washington about, for example, recognizing the occupation and annexation of Western Sahara, about getting taken off the terrorist list, about getting a fistful of F-35s and so on. And the other part of this transaction was normalization of diplomatic relations with Israel. And I think if you look at Egypt's role last month, it's very similar. I very much agree with everything Aaron has said. But I would really also particularly emphasize that Egypt was not only motivated by its long-term national security interest in Palestine, and particularly the Gaza Strip, given geographic proximity, but also by using this to establish and improve relations with the Biden administration. I don't think the name Sisi was ever mentioned in Washington before this latest conflagration, and all of a sudden, Biden was calling Sisi several times a day, so to speak. So I think it's important to recognize that many of these parties are acting and are motivated to a very large extent, and even primarily, by their relationship with the United States rather than with the parties directly involved.
Thanks, Maureen. Celine, of course, I'd love to have your thoughts on any of the issues that have been discussed, particularly with regard to third parties and the regional role. But I want to dig down a little bit deeper on the reconstruction effort. One of the things that you've argued, and I think is logically very sound, and I think also conventional wisdom, is that the current reconstruction effort should focus on two things. The first is avoiding anything that would benefit Hamas materially or politically. And second, doing it in a way that would involve or at least facilitate the return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. Those seem like the two biggest challenges. I mean, are either of these even possible, bearing in mind in terms of the former? I mean, we all know it's a standard unwritten rule of politics that the party in power gets the credit regardless of whether or not they're actually involved. And so if the situation improves in Gaza, it seems almost inevitable that that would benefit Hamas politically, which is also, again, the logic of maintaining the blockade. The whole point of the blockade is to make the situation so bad that people blame Hamas. So is it even possible to do those two things? And with regard to the second, and this is a question, we have several questions in the Q&A from the audience, how do you bring in a Palestinian Authority that, as Maureen said, is actually disintegrating, if not physically, at least in terms of its legitimacy, as we're seeing right now in the West Bank? So how do you actually do those two things?
Well, first, there is no doubt that this is a very complicated effort to pursue and that there is no silver bullet that can address the various layers of complexity related to the internal Palestinian tensions and Gaza stabilization effort. In my view, there are, I will divide it into three main principles for a strategy that will aim at facilitating the return of the PA to Gaza. First, and as you correctly said, Khaled, such strategy cannot be limited to Gaza only. The PA cannot be expected to contribute to an effort that will only benefit Gazan when there is no progress whatsoever in the situation in the West Bank. And its role will not be sustainable when there are tensions and provocations in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And therefore, it cannot be a Gaza-only strategy. Two, any efforts aimed at facilitating the PA's involvement in Gaza need to be gradual and supported by a broad coalition that includes Israel and the United States, and that will encourage proactively the resumption of Egyptian mediation effort between Hamas and Fatah. And I very much agree with what Maureen said, that for Egypt, it is critical to have the support of the US and to be seen as US as a player. And this is something they keep repeating all the time. Now, gradualism means also that the expectation cannot be that the precondition for the PA's engagement is Hamas disarmament, which is something that we've heard from the PA after 2014 war. And therefore, it also requires to understand that from day one, the PA will not be able to be a player that acts to enforce a ceasefire in Gaza and be held responsible for such ceasefire. And three, power sharing arrangements will also require that Hamas will see a value in such cooperation. Fatah and Hamas tend to assess their policy and actions as a zero-sum game, what benefit to Hamas arm Fatah and vice versa. And therefore, in my view, any strategy related to Gaza requires also to better define a policy towards Hamas and outline incentives for Hamas to cooperate. Such policy cannot only be based on deterrence. It needs also to aim at transforming, and my apologies, Aaron, for believing in transformation. I'm an optimistic. So at transforming Hamas into a non-violent player. We know that Hamas deeply aspires to political recognition and engagement. And in my view, this aspiration needs to be leveraged And that means that the condition for greater engagement with Hamas should be clarified in a way that ultimately enable a gradual transformation of the organization into an unarmed political entity. Obviously, I'm looking long term when I'm saying that. But what does that mean concretely is also that violence should be an absolute condition for engagement and for participation in elections. And this is something I think that the US should have clarified when the issue of Palestinian election was still in the agenda, while the two other quartet conditions be required at a future and more relevant stage if and when Hamas is to join the PLO, and mutual recognition if and when there is a peace agreement that is signed with Israel. So it was important for me also to point at the issue of a policy toward Hamas, because even though I'm very much focusing right now on how to engage and involve the PA, we should be aware that there is an internal dynamics there, and that one cannot totally exclude the other.
Thank you, Celine. I think that's a good segue to my next question to Aaron. Aaron, for the past 15 years or so, the basic thrust of U.S. and Israeli policy has been to treat Gaza and Hamas as though they were outside of what we used to call the peace process, and in some ways even a separate conflict. I can remember how many times have we seen, negotiations happening with the West Bank, with the leadership in the West Bank, and within months or weeks of those, you have fighting in Gaza. That seemed to be an approach that was put in place by the Bush administration and has basically held through inertia and other reasons as a part of U.S. policy. But clearly, as we saw, the linkage, Hamas has been very effective in being able to link to Jerusalem, particularly in ways, particularly given the PA's perceived inability to respond to those challenges there. All of this was based on the view that Hamas was so bad, in fact, that it can never be normalized. It was simply beyond the pale, can never be legitimized in any way, either as part of a diplomatic process or in the context of Palestinian politics. Clearly, that approach has failed. Do you see a way for Hamas to be politically integrated, at least within the context of Palestinian politics? And if so, how, particularly given the almost reflexive opposition to anything that might give Hamas a sense of normalcy in Palestinian politics here in Washington?
Let me get to that, but I want to draw a distinction first, Khaled, between Israeli policy with respect to Hamas and American policy. US policy essentially was avoidance, both by statute and domestic politics, and the complexity of Palestinian politics. The United States simply was unwilling and or unable to engage with Hamas. The Israeli strategy, however, was quite different, and it was quite willful. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago in Foreign Affairs on why Israel and Hamas need one another. And I think, particularly under Benjamin Netanyahu, there was a concerted effort to support what in his mind was a three-state solution, mini enclaves in Gaza and the 40% of the West Bank that Abbas controls, and the state of Israel. That keeping Hamas in Gaza was very important to Israeli interest. Yes, they had to deal with Hamas's high trajectory weapons every now and then. But the reality is, for the Israelis and for Netanyahu for sure, Hamas provided an insurance policy, because as long as the Palestinian national movement looked like Noah's Ark, where there were literally two of everything, two statelets, two sets of security services, two sets of patrons, two visions of where Palestine should be and what it should be, the odds of a single unified Palestinian negotiator presenting itself as the interlocutor representing Palestinians was completely off the table. Besides the fact that if Israelis wanted to cease fire, they didn't go to Abbas, they went to Hamas. If Israelis wanted their prisoners back, they didn't go to Abbas, they went to Hamas. So I think Celine may be right that one of the intriguing changes that is occurring with the new government is at least perhaps a more openness on the issue of strengthening the Palestinian Authority and finding a way to integrate them to some degree back into Gaza. As far as the US is concerned, I see virtually no chance of any sort of front door direct efforts to integrate Hamas into American strategy. It's a terrorist organization. Yes, it's a political organization and a social movement as well. And that has to be grasped and realized. But right now, US law by statute forbids assistance. It actually conditions heavily assistance to both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So you have to wonder what role, and then you have the congressional constraint. All of this, frankly, is driven, in my judgment, again, by the prime directive in terms of this administration's thinking. Fixing America's broken house is its primary mission. Anything that appears politically controversial or not productive, they're going to avoid. Now, if you ask me, is there a way for Hamas to integrate itself into the process? The answer is absolutely. But it won't come through the front door, it'll come through the back door. And the back door is what both Moeen and Celine have referred to. It is the most rational and logical approach to dealing with Gaza, which is a PA, not just Palestinian Authority presence in Gaza, but an integration into some sort of functional governing structure between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Smart Israelis, the ones who have formerly had positions in the military and intelligence security services, will argue this, that a coherent, integrated leadership is critically important to that sort of stability. I just do not see, and hard for me to imagine, that integration, that unification, and here's what I'm talking about. Final point. I'm talking about a situation, and most national movements that succeed ultimately have to have a unified structure. Whether it's the IRA in Sinn Féin, whether it's the FLN in Algeria, whether it's the Viet Cong, there is a reckoning. Usually it happens violently. We had this discussion with Arafat, I remember, and he used to go on and on about the democratic character of the Palestinian national movement. He would not force, through a quote unquote night of the long knives, an integration to bring those Palestinian factions into an integrated sort of governing structure or Palestinian national movement. I just do not see, not just with respect to Gaza, but to the whole issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace, how you can pursue such a thing without a leadership that is based on one gun, one authority, and one negotiating position. Other national movements have succeeded, not just because of that, but that was elemental to their success. And that does not exist. And it's profoundly disturbing, because I think it's a critically important piece to challenging, frankly, both Israeli and American conceptions and preconceptions of the problem. Sorry to drone on, but I think it's a really important point.
No, thank you for that. And that's another perfect segue to the next question for Maureen. How do we get a coherent Palestinian political entity of some sort? If the goal is to integrate Hamas politically, how do you do that without it coming at the expense of the Palestinian Authority, which is something obviously that Mahmoud Abbas would resist, but also the international community? is likely to resist anything that would appear to strengthen Hamas and weaken the Fatah-dominated leadership.
Yeah.
So can this even be done? Can you strengthen the PA, bring it back to Gaza, integrate Hamas, begin reconstruction, all at the same time, or at least in a logical sequence that makes sense? And if you were planning a roadmap for that sequence of a coherent Palestinian leadership, what would you start with? What is step 1, step 2, and step 3?
Right. Thank you, Khalid. I listened with great interest to Aaron's last response. And if I may, just 2 small caveats to what he said. The first is that while I agree with his analysis of Netanyahu, I would also point out that, in my view, the primary reason that Israel has supported the existence of competing administrations in the West Bank and Gaza Strip has been the pursuit of Palestinian fragmentation, which has been on the Israeli agenda since the early 1990s. And the primary objective of fragmentation is to facilitate and enable the consolidation of Israeli rule in the West Bank and settlement expansion and so on, more than anything else. Secondly, I would also point out that particularly during the 1960s and 70s, Palestinian pluralism was unavoidable given the powerful sponsorship of various Palestinian factions by competing Arab regimes and the existence of demographic and geographic dispersal of Palestinian communities and their national movement. And so I would question whether what Aaron is recommending, to basically have a single party in charge of the Palestinian national movement under those circumstances, could have been realizable. Now, to return to your question, Khalid, I think the absolute precondition for the development of a successful Palestinian leadership is that Palestinians need to establish their own leadership and develop their own agenda and set their own objectives and formulate their own strategy based on what best serves Palestinian interests, and not in an effort to gain the support of outside parties, whether the United States, which at the end of the day is, for all intents and purposes, often more pro-Israeli than Israel itself, not to, curry favor with regional parties or the European Union. These parties do not have the Palestinians' best interests at heart, and therefore concessions on fundamental issues should not be made to them. Now, we've talked a lot about the Palestinian Authority. My own view is that the Palestinian Authority should not be the locus of either Palestinian reconciliation or the revival of the Palestinian national movement, because what Palestinians desperately need is a unified political agenda, a unified leadership, and a remobilization of the Palestinian people in its entirety, irrespective of its location. And that requires the revival of the PLO in a manner that includes and incorporates Hamas and Islamic Jihad, or in an extreme situation, the development of an alternative to the PLO, which I think would be even more difficult. Now, just to go briefly to the other part of your question, well, maybe the PA should be weakened. If the PA is such a failure in serving Palestinian interests that it has lost the support of its people and has support only in Brussels and Washington, and to a limited extent in Tel Aviv, why should the Palestinian Authority be strengthened at the expense of Hamas or anyone else? That may serve the American interest, that may serve the Israeli or European interest, but it doesn't serve the Palestinian interests. And I think after 3 decades of Oslo, Palestinians have to insist once again on putting their own rights and interests first. Now, just as a final point, during the past 10 years, one Palestinian analyst who I enormously respect, Hani al-Masri, had always been recommending that what Hamas and Fatah should do is simply establish a national unity government. Let a Palestinian game be the only game in town for a change. And the Europeans and others, as many European diplomats will privately say, would find themselves with no choice but to deal with the actually existing Palestinian leadership. And you would see very quickly, that all these ideological conditions and quartet conditions and so on would basically be overtaken by reality.
Thanks, Ma'in. Celine, I want to come back to you, and as like many of you, I've been looking and thinking about this issue for many years, and one really striking aspect of this is the blockade hasn't just devastated life in Gaza. It's not even clear what it will take to lift the blockade. If you ask Israelis, whether in government or civil society, you get a whole range of answers. Some people talk about disarming Hamas. People talk about deterrent, making sure Hamas can't have certain kinds of weaponry, keeping Hamas weak, dismantling Hamas, its infrastructure. We don't actually know. From an Israeli standpoint, since, I know people like to call it an Israeli-Egyptian blockade, but this is a blockade that originated as a matter of Israeli policy. The Egyptians, I think, support it and acquiesce in it in different ways. But the decision to impose an air, land, and sea blockade is an Israeli one. What would it take for the government in Israel, this or a future government, to say, in a blue sky scenario, this is what is needed, 1, 2, 3, for the blockade to be lifted? Is it Hamas's removal? Is it Hamas's disarmament? Is there any clarity from what you see on the Israeli side with regard to that question?
Okay. I agree that the conditions for removal of the restriction are very unclear, and that this is part of the problem. I want to focus, when I respond to your question, not about the blockade, because I think it's a term that it's difficult to understand what we exactly refer to when we say that. I want to focus on the restriction at the land crossings, because I think this is what is relevant now. Not that I don't aspire that there will be also removal at the maritime restriction, but for the purpose of the discussion that focuses on today's reality, I think it's less realistic. And I think that in regard to the restriction to which I referred, it's important to understand that there are some that are security motivated, and that there are some that are politically motivated, and basically as results of pressure by various lobbyist groups with economic interests. And it bizarrely, they are the ones that are even more difficult to remove. But there are different schools of thoughts in Israel in regard to the security motivated restriction. But the zero risk tolerance approach, which is the one that we have seen in recent years, tends to dominate when the leadership is weak. And therefore, in my view, the key to your response in regard specifically to what I'm addressing now, I think is the leadership. Now, for this leadership to emerge and be challenged, to define a coherent policy towards Gaza stabilization, I think it needs to be engaged more strongly and challenged on that issue. And I not in broad terms, but in very specific terms. And at the political level, Israel tends to lower the discussion to bureaucrats, and we excel in that. And I think most particularly by the US administration, and I'm hearing what Aaron is saying in regard to the need to be reasonable in our expectation for a US engagement, but I think it would be very difficult to see a shift of policy unless the US engage our defense minister, and we have a defense minister that I think could be sensitive to a US engagement, and our foreign minister. Now, no doubt that the removal of restriction at the crossing needs to be part of any strategy aimed at stabilizing Gaza. I'm not saying the opposite. I really think that it's an important pillar. As I said, I do not exclude the possibility that the current government could be the one that leads a different policy on that issue, but provided it is engaged and challenged more strongly on that issue.
Thank you, Celine. In the 4 minutes that we have left, I want to ask you all to make any concluding remarks that you'd like in a sort of lightning round, like 1 minute each, literally. If there was one step that you, so this is my question to you, and then please feel free to make any concluding remarks. If there was one step that you would like to see taken in order to diffuse the situation or alleviate the crisis in Gaza, what would it be and who would it be by? Is the first step something the Palestinians should do, the international community, Israel, Egypt, or the United States? And so real quick, I want to put that question to each of you, starting with Moeen. What's the first step that needs to be taken and by whom?
First step is that the Palestinians now have a real opportunity to reunify and to mobilize. And what they need to do is unify, mobilize, and they need to learn to, or need to begin to once again confront Israel, to confront those who support Israel, rather than consistently seeking to pacify them. We've had 30 years of pacification. Look where it's gotten us. The Palestinians need to find a way to effectively confront those policies that have put them at a moment of existential crisis.
Aaron, what's the one step that you'd like to see?
I mean, look, as far as Gaza is concerned, there's simply an absence of ownership. And the vaunted international community that has failed to rise to so many different challenges, including the most extraordinary world-altering event since the end of the Second World War, COVID. It's a demonstration in fecklessness, distraction, and other priorities. Somebody needs to own this and then coordinate it. And at the moment, there is no one, in my judgment, is willing to do that. One last comment on the broader issue. I it's maybe too reductionist, but I've always believed that leadership is critically important. And right now you have leaders just about everywhere who are prisoners of their ideologies and their politics, not masters of them. Without leadership, we're going to be paralyzed, and worse, things are going to deteriorate.
Celine, what's the one step you'd like to see to begin to address this crisis?
I don't think we can do without the US leadership on that. I think that the US needs to be the one that outline a mechanism and to clarify to Israel what it expects from them to do. I think that the fact that the US administration has low ambition in regard to the peace process actually make it an advantageous when it comes to Gaza, because our government does not need to be threatened by the prospect of a US administration challenging us on the core issues, but it should be made clear that it doesn't mean that it has no expectation at all on issues that at least ideologically are less sensitive. And I think it's a point that when we have soft leaders that are still young in their political career, I think it means that they also can be, maybe Play-Doh is a bit not the right word, but you know, they can be somehow empowered by a U.S. engagement in the right direction.
Thank you. That pretty much wraps up our session. That's all the time that we have. Thank you to our amazing panelists for an incredibly rich discussion. Aaron Miller, Moeen Rabbani,
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for participating. Thank you for your questions. A reminder that this session has been recorded and you can access it immediately after we close. Thanks again, and we hope to see you back at our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.